Commercial photography as a profession is relatively young compared to all the other professions in photography. Because of that, it is really not a craft right now. It's kind of a bag of tricks. We go, we assist, we study, we watch what a photographer is doing, then we go open our own studio and kind of repeat what we've been seeing. Nothing unique about it, really redoing what's already been done. But if we can stop for a moment, treat it as a profession, but organize the craft in a very thought-provoking process to where you have a much more concise ability to create what hasn't been created because you understand the craft, and then your imagination can pretty well do it as you want.
An exercise in total control, this commercial studio shot creates the feeling of motion and uses time to do some clever retouching. The complete understanding of photography as a craft enables this photograph to be achieved with amazing predictability.
This particular shot was asked for by Yamaha to show their bike in a high-quality detail. They wanted to see every last thing about this particular new bike. It was going to be a poster series, which was going to be blown up to a very large areas, so people could walk up and see fine detail on the bike. This called for a studio shot, but yet they didn't want the bike just sitting on a background. They just wanted it within motion, within an environment, showing high speed. So it really called for a studio shot, but yet it called for an outdoor situation. So we had to really create an outdoor quality indoors, which produces that large, things that large sweet light, lighting the bike for its chrome, motion, but yet again showing the very fine, sharp detail. This is why we call on an 8x10 camera to show the fine detail, and this is why we brought in the studio to utilize the motion.
Simple motion begins in an empty cove studio as Colin's assistant Kevin sets up the first of 6 Lightform P22 frames to build a box. The sturdy vinyl tubing can create a simple and lightweight bounce box in minutes. Double clips are used to secure the panels together, while corner supports are added to keep rigid 90-degree angles at the corners of the box. H-support braces with attachable strobe mounts on the crossbars provide vertical support to the box and a means to attach the lights to the inside of the box. These Lightform braces are also made from sturdy vinyl tubing. The crew then adds several horizontal support bars to the frame of the box, adding lateral strength which keeps the box from bowing when the tight-fitting skin is strapped on. 2 separate sections of the skin with rubberized white reflective fabric inside, sewn to a black ripstop nylon outer shell, are pulled over the frame. The black outer fabric will contain any ambient light that would normally escape the box. A zipper then connects the 2 skins, creating a single 13-foot by 6 1/2 foot bounce box. A diagram reveals that these boxes, usually used as separate bounce boxes, can easily be added to one another to create a box of any length. Lightform EC1 clamps are then placed over the skin and clipped to the box on both sides. 2 13-foot steel shafts are then connected to the clamps to create rigid supports and provide a means for connecting the pulleys to raise the bounce box above the studio floor.
The problem with producing large sources of illumination to illuminate these bikes or any car or anything that calls for large specularity is weight factor. These things are heavy. Boxes are normally heavy. They're normally made out of foam board. They're made out of plywood. They're very, very heavy, very difficult to travel with. So we took the same system we have all along, the panels which collapse down, fold up, and go in cars. We've structured them together, snapped them together to where they build this large bank. Now, this particular one is 13 feet by 6 feet wide and can be 6 feet by how many ever feet you want to keep locking these panels together. The structures are then, these 6 panels are snapped together, build an entire framing, covered with a skin of black ripstop nylon on the outside, white on the inside for reflective capability. The black is to keep any of the ambient light from kicking around the room, because remember, with a lot of this ambient kicking around, this shiny bike is going to see anything that strikes in the studio, so it's very important that we keep that light contained. The actual skin that we snap onto it and buckle onto it is holding the frames together. That's what makes it so rigid. So we're not having to use so much weight to do it. We're not having to use steel. We're actually using lightweight plastic. So as this thing's bolted together by the materials, it holds its own shape. The only problem with this is suspension. In this case, we ran steel members across, connected what we call EC1s onto the box those EC1s connected onto these steel members, and that's what's connected onto the pulleys. As we then pull the two steel bars up, it brings the box up and keeps it very rigid. So the whole system, the box alone weighs around 17 pounds. With the steel, we're probably up to around 35 pounds. Very easy to travel with. With the light now aimed at the back of the box, kicking off of the back, illuminated evenly, you pick up a very, very clean specular highlight on these objects. If we were to aim the light down through the diffusion material, you would then pick up two hot spots on the actual product seen shown through the diffusion material, the front ripstop nylon.
4 bi-pulley systems attached to the steel shafts aid in lifting the box to a height at which the crew can work underneath. A box made from heavier supports would not be as easily maneuvered around the studio, and could also prove to be a hazard to the crew if anything were to happen to the support ropes. Inside the box, Dean secures the skin to the frame of the box with nylon cinch belts, giving the box one more added touch of stability. 2 1,000-watt Lowell total lights are mounted, one on each end, to the H-support strobe mounts, and the power cords are pushed through the zipper holes in the skin. Kevin aims the lights at the top of the box to bounce the light for soft, even illumination. Outside the box, the power cords are pulled through the zipper holes and carried to a central point above the box for power. Collins makes a final check on each of the stress points of the box, and then calls for the front diffusion material to be added. The crew pulls a panel of white ripstop nylon over the bottom of the box. Velcro tabs sewn into the fabric secure the panel to the box and are easily adjustable to pull any wrinkles out of the fabric. A diagram shows that by bouncing the lights off the inner ceiling of the box, we create a light source with even illumination from corner to corner. Dean Collins explains the process of having a background painted for the photograph.
The background was created by putting together a 20-foot by 10-foot stretcher frame, stretching muslin over and stapling it around. Muslin you buy from stage and lighting performance houses, which build the large painted backgrounds for movie theaters. A painter was brought in to produce the scene that we wanted. In this case, we wanted the person to go by buildings. Why buildings? Because it offered vertical lines, windows, to where by modulating the amount of motion of the background, you could show how fast the bike was going. If you wanted to go very, very fast, you move the background a lot. If you wanted just to have a kind of a semi-speed to the bike, you move it slowly to where the buildings don't really break up too much. The horizontal lines offered us the pastel transfers of the day. By working with the warm hues of the base and going up to the bluer hues, we produced the same qualities you would see in late afternoon sunset. And it didn't really matter how concise the painting was, because the motion would totally blend them together, just like in retouching and enlarger.
With the background now in the studio, 2 casters are added to the bottom of the background frame, and 2x4 A-frame supports are attached to both ends of the painted background. Casters are also added to the bottoms of each of the A-frame supports. The background is then lifted upright and placed at the back of the cove to provide plenty of workspace for the next stage of the photograph. The Yamaha motorcycle is wheeled into position on top of a 4-foot by 8-foot sheet of plywood used to support the bike stands and brace. Dean Collins explains why he will use the 8x10 format to shoot the bike.
The 8x10 is used in this situation because we are in a studio environment. We don't have to worry so much about moving. We can lock it down on heavy studio stands. And when they blow this up to the poster size it's going to be, we want the bike to be a sharp, fine detail there is. Now let's say during the exposure, this long exposure, there is a slight movement in the bike. Well, in a medium format expansion, you're going to see it as they blow it up 4 or 5 times. But on an 8x10, seeing they're only going to blow it up twice the size of the original film, if there is a little bit of motion, you're not going to see it as much as you were on a smaller piece of film.
Collins assembles his Scene P 8x10 camera with a copal shutter for DB-mounted lenses. This system automatically closes the shutter, and the aperture will close down when the shutter cable is depressed. An extension rail is added for bellows extension, and the camera is locked down. Dean adds a 300mm Schneider lens and then zeroes out the movements on the camera to ensure proper image perspective. The automatic shutter cable and cable release are added to complete the 8x10 system. Back on the set, the crew lifts the motorcycle up onto the first of two specially angled and welded braces. The front brace is attached to the engine mount and then slipped onto a jack stand to raise the bike nearly a foot off of the ground. The brace is then secured to the engine mount to ensure a solid support for the heavy motorcycle. The second brace is attached to the rear axle of the bike and is also set onto a jack stand. The crew then adjusts the motorcycle to be parallel to the background on its stands. Kevin wires a 2x4 to the frame of the bike and secures the other end to the plywood base. This assures Collins that the bike will remain at the desired angle and safely support the weight of the rider. Before Collins begins to light the motorcycle, Armor All is added to create specularity on the rubber tires. Now ready to begin the task of lighting, Collins chooses the exact camera height and angle as his point of view to direct the placement of the overhead bounce box. A correctly placed specular highlight on the gas tank is his goal.
When looking at an object such as a motorcycle or a car, something with a very high surface efficiency, something that's been waxed, you're normally going to see the environment that it was recorded in, or at least identify the environment that it was recorded in by looking in the specular highlights, the reflections in the mirrors, the reflections on the tank, the reflections on the hood of the car. So this can be artificially created, the environment of being outside, by cutting out paper mountain ranges, cover them with black paper, and then putting them in the way of the light boxes. So when you look at it in the specular highlight, it seems to appear as a mountain range. The sun is set behind the mountain range, creating this large bank of illumination. We didn't do it in this particular one because we didn't really need that environment to show up, but it is done quite often in studio environments to create that illusion of being outside. That specular highlight's got the nice broken edge right here. And
Collins points out the specular qualities that the bounce box is providing the bike.
On the Yamaha, so there's contrast to it, but it gives a real, it shows that bike has got a real nice paint job to it, and that Yamaha painting, that airbrush quality of that very light to the very dark, just really, really evenly illuminates it well. You got a lot of freedom and light here, and you got good illumination top to bottom. This guy's great. We may end up having to put a boom here.
Dean decides that a 500-watt photo flood should be placed on a boom stand close to the background to create a rapid fall-off of light.
Okay. Yeah, just about like that. Yeah, go ahead and dig a boom up, just that little Manfrotto boom. Bring it about in there and just kick in a real bright spot right there. And then as it's in the set, it'll be real nice to give a reason for it.
A Roscolux amber gel is added for a warm sun effect.
Okay. Lower down.
From behind the 8x10 camera, Collins directs his crew in the placement of large sheets of white foam board to create the illusion of a street. The ground level of the street in the photograph is directly related to the camera height and angle that is set by Collins. Using white boards helps Dean to see the position of the street level on the ground glass.
You're fine, Spence, fine. Yeah, just a little bit dip on just the front end area.
A 4-foot wide roll of black plastic is then brought in to create the wet street look. Collins explains the technique.
The creation of motion on a road can be created by several different surfaces. We wanted an early morning wet feeling, the road being moist from the early morning dew. So instead of using tar paper like one normally will, we put black visqueen out there, which gives that high surface efficiency, a lot of reflections, and you actually see that it's a mirrored image of the bike, which gives that illusion of being wet, as you always would see in the morning. The visqueen was moved about 4 feet in front of the bike, brought up to where it's right even with the wheels. And the reason we did that instead of bringing it into the bike is we wanted to be able to put reflector boards underneath the bike to kick light up from the large light box onto it, kicking it up and showing the illumination of the manifolds, the exhaust manifolds. If it was black exhaust pipes, we probably wouldn't be so concerned with this, but in this particular bike we were. So bringing it forward and putting those reflector boards.
With the plastic laid out across the foam board, a hot air paint stripper is used to reduce the packing folds and create a smoother surface. Moving the plastic during the timed exposure will eliminate any other imperfections in the plastic. With the wet street in place, the crew begins to make preparations for the first Polaroid check print. Strips of tape are used to cover the headlight of the bike, leaving only one side exposed toward the camera. This prevents light from spilling onto the painted background while still giving the appearance of a lighted headlamp. A riding suit supplied by Yamaha is then donned by our rider, Dave Lovell, as the excitement begins to build in the studio. Working from the ground glass of his camera, Dean directs the placement of a small sheet of foam board under the bike. Painted to match the background, the foam board will act as a unique dodging tool during the long exposure.
To create the motion of the bike, the only thing that's really moving on the bike is the wheels. The rider's holding still. So to be able to move the wheels, we had to bring the bike up. Once the bike was up and suspended off the ground, the wheels would spin freely. We moved the wheels by monofilament lines, which were tied around the wheels, slowly pulled out, and as they were pulled out, it spun the wheel slowly. You only had to move it about, an eighth of the revolution, when that would give the full motion necessary. But by bringing it up off the ground, it gave us a problem. The problem was you could see the support bars behind it blocking out the background. The way we solved that was bringing in small boards, foam boards painted the same color as the background, and then by moving them during the 6-second exposure, totally retouched out and removed any of these support device. It's a very inexpensive way of what would normally cost a lot of money going to retouchers to retouch those 8x10 chromes. This whole thing is coming right in there.
Collins and his assistant discuss some needed touch-ups to the foam board and the amount of movement necessary to effectively dodge out the supports under the bike.
As dark as I possibly can. And this is all fine. This is going to block up, and that wedges in real good. So, like I say, they're going to instead of 3 or a 4, maybe a 6-second to make sure it really blends in, or just keep moving it. It should be right on. Yeah.
Great.
Monofilament fishing line is attached to both the front and back wheels and then guided through the treads of the tires as the wheels are readied for the first check print. During the exposure, the wheels are turned slightly to produce the illusion of motion and speed. A graphic reveals that only a quarter turn is necessary to produce the motion effect. A close look at the specular highlight in the rider's black helmet reveals to Collins that the wrinkles in the overhead bounce box will indeed be visible on an 8x10 chrome. A crew member suggests that slightly moving the box during the exposure should smooth out any wrinkles in the highlights.
Yeah, we'll try it. Yeah.
Dean takes an incident meter reading to establish a hypothetical 18% value in the subject area, and then dials in an aperture of f32.4 with a shutter speed of 8 seconds.
So 32.4. 32.4, say 80.
The highly reflective chrome is polished as the rider sets into position. Collins checks his final focus by looping the ground glass of the camera. By focusing 1/3 the distance through his desired range of focus, Dean is assured of the proper depth of field in the photograph. Some final communication concerning the dodging tool convinces Collins that it will cover the supports. The assistant will remain hidden behind the bike throughout the exposure.
Okay, we've got the background. You're at the shot.
Collins clears up any questions from the crew before the first Polaroid is exposed.
Because you don't want to run out of string, because if you run out of string, it's going to have a sharp image. Okay, so you just want to slowly pull it out, and you can spin the whole thing. Kevin, you know your mark's right there. Okay, that's fine. You keep hidden. Okay, everybody set? Okay, here we go.
As Tony sets the box into motion, each crew member prepares to do one of the many jobs that must take place simultaneously. The background, dodging tool, tires, plastic street, and bounce box must all be in motion during the exposure to create the desired effect. The exposure is 8 seconds at f32.4. A Polaroid 8x10 processor is used to produce an instant 8x10 check print. The first attempt, a disappointment. The long exposure of light to the film has caused a reciprocity failure.
The sun looks real good. The sun looks like a sun. My only concern is that looks like black visqueen there. I think it's going to look like black visqueen.
Can we go faster with it? Our gobo the sun off.
I don't know. Until we get a good exposure, we're really not going to know, you know. But the bike looks good. Everything looks good. I think we're just going to have to bring up and I'm going to.
Collins decides that an increase in aperture of 2 stops should compensate for the problem.
Do another one. Okay, here we go.
A second exposure is made at f16.4 at 8 seconds.
like this a lot. I like this an awful lot. What do you think?
I think the black is great other than mine. Sitting is great. Wheels are great.
Everything's good. I'm gonna have to drop this guy. The street looks wet, doesn't it? Or does it look like visqueen to you? I don't know. What do you think? Just a drop, but the bike looks fabulous. Look at all the lines, dimensions, everything is there. God, boots look fabulous. The light quality on that is, look at that specular on that right across Yamaha. Low angle was chosen on the bike to photograph the bike so we could see the underneath carriage, see the exhaust manifolds, and pick up that illusion of that reflection in early morning. We didn't want to shoot down on it because we'd lose that reflection foam. The lens we used was a 300 millimeter lens on an 8x10. The reason we didn't go with anything wider is because we'd have to have a larger background, a longer background. The longer the millimeters we can get, the smaller the background can be, because we're only going to move at 14 inches. If we had a wide-angle lens, we'd have to have a very large background to create that motion. We shot it almost wide open. We were around 11, 16. We didn't really care too much about depth of field because we only had to carry the focus the width of the rider, and that's just about all we was necessary.
It has been decided that better separation is needed between the subject and the background. A 650-watt quartz lamp is placed on a boom stand and aimed at the rider's back and the back wheel of the motorcycle. An amber gel was added to the light to be consistent with the sunset effect.
Kick this guy back on, off and on.
Note the highlights from the quartz lamp on the rider's jacket and the back tire of the bike. Also, the dodging tool has been painted black to better blend with the background. To provide separation for the front tire, Collins uses a can of extra dry antiperspirant spray, making sure to turn the tire while spraying the edge to create an even highlight. Wrinkles in the diffusion fabric can be seen in the specular highlight on the helmet, as the box and the crew are set into motion for the third test print.
1001, 1002, 1000, a little faster back there. 3, 1004, 1005, 1006, good, 1007, great.
The Polaroid is peeled, and Collins is pleased with the results.
Look at the wheel. Look at the wheel with that stuff.
Look at the reflection in the ground. Yeah. That's so sharp.
I can't see really what else to jink around with it.
He will now move on to the final exposures on film.
Helmet, yeah, the front tire is really showing itself well.
As the final image is put on film, our camera point of view reveals that the high-speed motion of the motorcycle is actually created by the motion of everything except the bike and its rider.
Okay, good, spin, super. Okay, super, great.
From the wet street to the setting sun, our final image captures the excitement of a wild ride through the city streets. By reviewing the steps that were followed to create simple motion, we can first see that without any motion in the set, the street is easily identified as plastic, the wheels are still, and our painted background does indeed look very painted. A second check print, complete with motion, gives us a realistic wet street and a city that looks very real also. Notice the support stands visible under the bike and the even specular form on the helmet and gas tank caused by the large overhead illumination. In our third check print, the foam board retouching tool is added to remove the support stands. The same principle is often used in the darkroom with a dodging tool or paddle. As long as it keeps moving, it doesn't show up on the final image. Finally, the warm sun photo flood, the separation highlight, and artificial spray highlight are added to complete this exciting studio image. A final diagram reveals the overall setup at the time of final exposure.
This is commercial illustration in its purest form. Group of people together, working together to produce a commercial illustration form of communication. Motorcycle, high speed, in a studio. That's a craft. The photograph I wanted to be totally mine and my crew's and not retouchers, to where we wanted to work out a way to remove those problems that would normally be done by a retoucher. And the comradeship. This is the purest form of it.
Due to the nature of Kodak's 6118 film, which is designed for long exposures, there was no reciprocity failure, thus the final exposure was 8 seconds at f32.5. Photographing the highly reflective surfaces of these dress watches requires an understanding of specular highlights and diffused highlights. Using a single light source, Collins retains complete control over this simple yet elegant photograph.
Lots of different types of jewelry are photographed. In each piece of jewelry is going to offer you a different type of problem in lighting, because when you light jewelry, the job is to produce a two-dimensional representation, a photograph, often for a magazine or a catalog, to where when you look at the shot, you use to identify surface quality, glass, crystal, is it gold, is it silver, the clarity, does it have leather in it? Sometimes they have metal mixed with leather, and there's lots of different surface qualities. So when you light it, you have to identify all shapes and all forms. Some reflections you want, and other reflections you do not want, because they hide certain tonalities or certain shapes within the jewelry. So lighting jewelry is probably one of the true forms of illustrative lighting, to where you really have to have a master of shadow form to diffuse form to specular form, and specular edge transfers to shadow edge transfers. There's a lot of characteristics in lighting these small, intricate pieces of jewelry that you're going to zoom in close, make 4x5s and 8x10 chromes up, to where you can identify all shapes and all forms and all textures.
Collins begins the shoot in his studio by rolling out a 3 1/2 foot roll of paper architectural vellum. A Lightform P22 frame is set up and laid directly over the vellum, making a perfect fit. Lightform single clips are used to secure the vellum to the frame. Using several clips helps to create and control the tension of the paper while attached to the frame. Excess vellum is then removed to create a simple and lightweight scrim. 2 Lightform EC1 clamps are then attached to light stands and are tightened down to form solid connectors for the scrim. The P22 panel and vellum are then connected to the clamps, forming the overhead scrim. Collins then utilizes 2 small sawhorses and 2 particle board planks to create a low and inexpensive tabletop work area. A sheet of white foam board with photographic leader paper is used as a working surface to set up the watches.
The different materials that we're going to work with, both the tabletop surface and the items that we lit with, are going to be simple materials. To light jewelry, you're going to work with a lot of reflections of the light sources. We'll call it specularity. If we work with our normal material, ripstop nylon, and lit through that, you would actually be able to see in parts of the faces of the watch and some of the very polished gold, you'd see reflections of the ripstop fiber. We didn't want that. So we lit through architectural tracing vellum, which you can buy at a graphic art supply store, and that gave a very clean specular highlight in the watches and in the this fine parts of the glass. The surface that it was laying on was it was a black polished paper. It was photographic leader paper, which they just throw away at labs. You can pick it up at no charge. But what it offered us with is a very smooth surface, but yet not so smooth that it picked up a perfect definition of the small gobos, which we were going to remove the reflections in the glass with. It picked up, instead of perfectly round circles on the surface, it picked up a very gradated edge between what we'll call the diffuse highlight and the specular. The black area being the diffuse highlight, and the white washed out area, the black paper, being the specular highlight. That edge transition right there is called the specular edge, which is controlled by several things, one being surface efficiency. So we didn't choose a black plexiglass, as a lot of people would. We chose a black paper, which had a little bit of a reticulated surface to it, which created a soft gradation between one brightness and the other, this one being the diffuse to the specular highlight.
A bare-bowl bronze-color strobe is placed on a boom stand and positioned over the scrim to create an even transition burst on the vellum. Double clips hold 2 Lightform P22 panels with black ripstop nylon on top of the scrim, acting as a gobo for the camera and the background while containing any ambient light spill. White reflective material was not used for the inside of the tent because the bounced light would evenly illuminate the vellum and ruin the burst effect. Power cables are then connected to the Pulso 4 power pack, and Collins sets the appropriate power and checks the operation of his strobe. Dean rolls in a tool cabinet carrying all of his photographic needs for a tabletop set and begins to work on the shot. An art director's layout of the proposed photograph is set next to the work area as Collins begins setting the watches up in the proper gradation area. As Collins works on the setup, he eyes the watches from the camera angle of view to ensure proper placement relative to the reflection of the light source on the paper. Once Collins is pleased with the setup, he tapes the watches down with masking tape to hold them securely on the slick surface of the paper. Collins places the tape far enough from the watch faces so they will be out of the frame for the photograph. The FOBA camera stand is then dropped into place with a 210mm DB lens on a Cinar P2 4x5 camera. Collins glides the horizontal support arm to its fullest extent to create plenty of workspace in front of the watches when the camera is pushed out of the way. An extension rail is added for the camera bellows extension that will be required for this type of close-up photographic work. Because the image is extended over such a distance, the image intensity drops on the film plane. Collins adds a 45-degree viewing hood for viewing ease. Dean adjusts his focus, sets the camera movements to ensure proper perspective of the circular faces of the round watches, and looks for proper placement of the specular highlights on the background surface. Pleased with the placement of the watches in his frame, Collins slides the 4x5 aside, giving him plenty of workspace to add a string of pearls. Working as a subliminal prop, the pearls not only identify that they are dress watches, but also carry the theme of spherical shapes throughout the photograph. Having previously marked the support arm position by number, Dean can easily return the camera to the exact same position and composition every time. A Calumet exposure calculator, or 2-inch rule, is set in the subject area to check for light loss from the bellows extension. The ruler, placed on the ground glass, measures the light loss in f-stops relative to the incident meter reading. Dean Collins explains.
We actually expanded this watch larger than it was in real life. It's a little bit more than a 1-to-1 increasement. We're going to go to what's called bellows extension, meaning that we're actually going to amplify the product bigger than it was designed for the lenses. We actually go into what's called bellows extension, to where the image is expanded over a larger area of the film plane than the apertures were designed to compute. So we'll go into an extension factor. There's several ways of computing that. There's ways of multiplying the square of 2, on and on. We find the easiest one is to buy for about $5 this little device called the 2-inch rule from Calumet. And it's a little piece of cardboard or plastic that has white on one side, black on the other, and you're going to put it in the set relative. If it's a white set, you're going to put it on the black side. If it's a black set, you're going to put it on the white side so you can see it. You put it right on the area of focus to where you are focused on. And then you take a small little rule and measure on the back of the ground glass, and it tells you what the extension factor is going to be. It's going to say, from what your meter's reading, open up a half a stop, a third a stop, 2 stops, relative to how much extension is there.
An incident meter reading is taken to set a hypothetical 18% value in the subject area. The first reading reads F45 at ISO 80, which is what Collins wants, but with the 2-stop bellows loss, Dean must increase the power to the strobe by 2 stops. The second reading reads F90, and with the 2-stop bellows loss, F45 will give the correct exposure. Dean dials in his f-stop on the Cinar. Collins pulls a sheet of Polaroid 59 from his cabinet and loads it into the 4x5 film holder for his first Polaroid check print. The Cinar P2 automatically closes the shutter when the film is loaded. By depressing the shutter cable release, the aperture is shut down to the preset opening and the exposure is made. The first Polaroid reveals that although the watch faces are washed out, the overall exposure is correct. Collins will first work on the transition from the specular highlight to the diffused highlight on the background paper. Collins now lowers the strobe head closer to the vellum for a faster light fall off and positions the burst in the lower part of the photograph so that the gradation from top to bottom is more evident. Once the position of the strobe is decided, a flag is dropped in to protect the lens from any ambient light from the overhead scrim. Small gobos are then cut from black matte cardboard, and an assistant places the gobos directly on the vellum to block out the specular highlights on the watch faces. Our second check print reveals that the gobos are not shadows, but reflections that reveal the diffused highlight or true tonality of the watch faces and black leader paper.
When you work with light qualities, we'll call it three-dimensional contrast. There are basically three densities you'll work with. You'll work with the diffuse density, you'll work with the specular density, and you'll work with the shadow. And the diffuse density, if I can just call it, is the true tonality. In this case, on the, let's say, the surface of the paper that we're taking a picture of this watch laying on, the true density of that paper was black, so the true exposure would be black. The specular highlight is the brightness that shows surface quality. It shows that it's smooth and it's shiny. It's usually brighter than the true brightness. And then the shadow is the area which receives less illumination than the diffuse, which is darker than the true tonality. So you'll say the specular is brighter than the true tonality, the shadow is darker than the true tonality, and the diffuse highlight is the true tonality. There are edge transfers between them. Not only are there contrast to the diffuse, but there is the gradation point between the diffused and the specular highlight. In this case, let's identify the surface of the paper, and you see that there are dark spots caused by these little gobos that are above the watch. Well, they're designed to clean up the face, the reflections of the watch, so you could see the true tonality of the watch face, which was black. If you didn't put those little gobos in there, you'd have washed out faces. You couldn't see the watches at the hands. You couldn't see the face of anything about the way what the watch looked like. And that's not good for an ad. I mean, nobody's going to want to buy that watch if it's all flared out. So we put the little gobos in there, cleaned up the face of the watch, but also on the surface, or on the surface below the watch, you saw these dark circles show up. Well, they're a dark circle, and people say, well, that's a shadow. It's not a shadow, it's a diffused highlight. It's the true tonality of black leader paper. And then you see this edge transfer, which goes into, from it gets lighter and lighter and lighter until now it's washed out, and that's the leader paper. That creates what we'll call tonalities and shapes. Artists have done that for years with pencils and carbons and on papers, and they've created shapes and forms. We are identifying a transfer edge there between the diffused and the specular. We are controlling it by several modes. The one this time that we're picking on is surface efficiency. Instead of using a plexiglass below it, like a lot of people will put that on plexiglass, if we put it on plexiglass, you'd see a perfectly sharp, cutout, in focus little dot. But working with leader paper, which has a little bit of a reticulated surface to it, it created a very soft transfer from the diffused to the specular and created a much more comfortable shot with this particular graphic design of the round shapes of the pearls and the roundness of the watch. We just added one more symmetrical form to that.
Collins and his crew agree on the placement of the gobos and decide to move on to the task of defining the true design features of the watches. A large foam board reflector is placed in front of the watches to define the base edges of each watch. Note the front and back edges of both watches and the added surface definition to the pearls. The large foam board is needed to reflect and define the entire round mirror edge of the watches. A smaller source would not cover the entire edge of the watches. Remember, the foam board creates a specular highlight in the watches and is not a reflector fill. Collins drops in a second, smaller foam board behind the watches to define the top edge of both the ladies' and the man's watch. Dean Collins explains the concept.
This entire shot is nothing more than an exercise in specular form, specular and diffuse form. There is not a shadow in the entire shot. You'll look at the black dots on the surface, those black circles. People say those are shadows. They aren't shadows. They're diffused highlights. They'll look at They'll look at the face of the watch. Well, you have to identify that it's a black face of the watch, so that's diffuse highlights. The reflections in the gold are specular highlights. So everything in it is either edge transfers between diffuse and specular or contrast between diffuse and specular. When I brought the reflector boards in from the top and the bottom to fill in and show actual form, those are specular highlights. Now, specular highlights in their actual terminology means mirrored image of the device that creates the highlight. If I would have put a blue card in there, those would have showed up as blue reflections, so it would look like you painted blue forms in there. So by putting white boards in there, it showed the true reflection of white, which is reflecting off of gold, which gave a light gold effect. So it is an exercise in contrast that the common laborer, the common person, does not normally see. This is probably the purest form of commercial photography I know in light control, because we're controlling reflections on surfaces, which is pretty unusual. Nothing between highlights and shadows here. It's between diffuse highlights and specular highlights.
Collins now makes some last-second adjustments before putting his final exposures on film. Dean double-checks each of his camera operations and, with the crew watching on, makes his final exposures. Our final image is a pleasing composition of simple elegance with good detail in the watch faces and true color and form throughout. A review of the techniques Collins used shows us that by moving the light source in close to the vellum, we can control the rate of gradation on the background, but at the same time it creates a mirrored image of the light source on the crystals. Our specular gobos remove specularity from the face of the watches and create a pleasing background design while also staying within the theme of shapes. With the addition of the first reflector board, detail is revealed in the front edge of the lady's watch and the back inner edge of both watches. Surface definition is also added to the pearls. Our final reflector board defines the back edges of both watches and completes the evolution of our photograph. Dean Collins adds some final comments.
If you really look at the shot and its total concept and application, you'll find that it was done with nothing more than architectural vellum, a couple of reflector boards, light source identified distance, creating certain specular qualities, transfer qualities, and finally a view camera. We use the best equipment we have. We use bronze, we use Cinars, very good optics to record it and to create the light. But the actual light qualities were created by identifying what you have to work with. It isn't just highlights to shadows. It's specular to diffuse to shadow and transfers between them. And if you start thinking that way, you can start producing a much better two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional object. And that's really what it comes down to, is when people look in those magazines, they want to know everything about that watch. They want to know its surface quality, that it's gold, that it's round, that it has these cut edges, that the band was a good leather material instead of just some naga hide. They want to know everything about it. So your job as a commercial illustrator is to show true depth and true roundness of a three-dimensional object, but you're only allowed to use a two-dimensional representation of it.
Photographing a highly reflective black sports car is one of the toughest jobs in lighting. In this exercise in specular form, large, clean sources of illumination are used to produce an image that features the strong lines of this infamous road car. Miles away lies a mountain range that adds to the surrealistic appeal of this heavenly Porsche.
Dealing with physical law, meaning size of objects, size of light sources relative to each other, you have to fall into the category of what we call the inverse law. It's also the law of perspective. Dealing with sources of illumination in close, we can work easily with specular highlights. You bring a light box in real close to a small product on top of a tabletop, you can coat the entire thing with a specular highlight because the size is so large relative to that distance. But working with a car this size, you can't work with a light source 2 feet away. You got to back it way up to coat the entire object. As you back it up, the object, the light source is going to diminish by the square of the distance. We call it perspective. If the light source is, let's say, 4 feet away from it, and it's a certain size, if you back it up to 8 feet, that source of illumination is going to be 1/4 the size. You back it up now to 16 feet, it diminishes to 1/4 again. So dealing with these laws, restraints, this is where we're going to start dealing with building large sources of illumination. The reason we're building large sources of illumination is not to have a soft quality of light, note it is between the diffuse highlight and the shadow. It is to produce large specularity, so since the specular highlight would be large and covering a larger area, it's going to be low in intensity. We need the specular highlight in this case. You can't get rid of it, because if you got rid of it, you wouldn't have a car. This car, the proper density of this car is black, so what are you going to work with, shadows? Obviously not. So you're going to be working with specularity. So it's a specular to diffuse highlight contrast range, but again, we're fighting with physical law. We had to back the light up to produce a very even illumination, but as we backed it up, it became small relative to that distance, so we had to keep increasing the size proportionally until we had the soft quality light. It is why you start seeing these large studios and these large cycloramas and painting large walls and illuminating that, is to deal with these physical restraints.
As the last areas of the cove are finished up, Dean Collins directs the Porsche into position and begins to plan his shot.
Keep going. Stop. Right there.
The back wheel of the car is driven up onto a stack of press boards, which lifts the rear end up and provides a better view of both the front and back end of the car from what will be camera position. Collins and his assistant begin to assemble a Cinar P2 8x10 camera onto the FOBA camera stand.
I guess. So they say. Okay.
Collins will use a 155mm Rodenstock Grandagon lens with the 8x10. On the opposite end of the FOBA stand, Collins mounts a Cinar P2 4x5 camera with a 90mm DB lens that will be used to establish the optical position for the photograph. After finding the proper angle and camera height, Collins loads the camera with Polaroid 55PN and shoots the first test shot under ambient light.
We'll get a shot of this guy. 8 seconds. Yeah.
The first black and white test print is used to check the placement of the car in the cove and to ensure the important features are visible.
The only problem is going to be able to get that illumination factor in there. We're going to just be screaming it down with it tipped over that way.
Collins uses 55PN when shooting dark objects, as the film is designed to give a full range of contrast when backlit. Dean can now decide if he likes the angle and perspective produced by the lens that he has chosen.
Cost factors on Polaroids can vary. 4x5 Polaroid is much cheaper than 8x10 Polaroid. So when we're finding our optic angle, or we're finding the angle we're going to photograph the car, we'll normally shoot with a 4x5 and checking the Polaroids to see if we have the angle and make sure that we're not distorting the car, we're really emphasizing the car. And once we get the position of the camera chosen, then when we start lighting it, that's when we'll go to the 8x10 Polaroid and shooting 8x10 Polaroid. We can save a lot of money by starting with 4x5 and then going to 8x10.
With the location of the car decided upon, an assistant marks the wheels on the floor with a grease pencil for later repositioning. Using a flashlight as a reference, Collins calls out the reflection points on the hood of the car to set up the outline of the mountain range. An assistant then begins sketching the outline of a mountain range, making sure to carefully follow the points marked on the cyc wall. With the sketching complete, the crew joins in to begin the task of painting a detailed mountain range along with the remainder of the cove wall, leaving all but the area directly above the mountains flat black. Dean Collins talks about using the cove as a source of illumination.
When you're gonna, this car is a giant mirror. It's going to see everything in the room. So when you first roll it out, you have to first of all decide the angle that you're going to take the car at. That's going to give you relative angle the way you're going to light it. You first of all choose the camera optic, camera angle. come in, get to a certain distance, and then you start walking around the car, and it's going to show you where you can place your sources of illumination to produce the proper highlighting. You don't light it, then choose your camera angle. You choose your camera angle, and then you light it. Instead of working with large reflector flats back here, we just work with an actual cyc wall, which gives that large cycorama. And we've just painted out the basin of it black to where behind it was black. We produced a mountain range effect on the wall to where now when we illuminated the top part of the wall, that was white. That showed up as specular highlights on the car, giving the form and definition to the car. But then it was sitting in a basin of black. It was just a lot easier to do it that way than to work with large bank of illumination. If you take a look at that cycorama wall, it is almost 40 feet from side to side. That's a large bank of illumination. Plus, we wanted that texture of mountain ranges to create that illusion of depth.
In the midst of the painting, the true artistic form of the crew is revealed in some very fancy brushwork. To protect the studio floor from water, the first of several sheets of black plastic is laid down. As the plastic is spread out, the edges are temporarily tacked down with duct tape, and then double-stick tape is used to secure the plastic to the cove above the water level. As the floor is covered, whiteout is used to copy the tire marks onto the black plastic. Strips of duct tape lock each sheet of plastic together after they have been doubled over. A diagram shows a method of double locking each layer of plastic to create a watertight seal. After the second layer of plastic is laid down, the duct tape is sprayed black to blend with the plastic. A roller is used to smooth the black paint on the finished cove, and the Porsche is brought back into position using the previously marked spots as a reference. Notice the accurate placement of the mountain reflections in the hood of the car.
You get to take one picture of this car. You have to have one angle which shows all form. Usually with a car, one angle, with the car sitting properly, all four on the ground evenly, that one angle is not going to show the full detail. In this case, we have the whale tail and the front end. You had to see both the back end and the front end within one angle. We chose the front angle because that's the most emphasized and probably the most known angle for a Porsche, but we also wanted to show it as a whale tail. So dropping a series of boards underneath the back wheel, propping the whole rear end of the car up just a little bit to where when you look at the front of the car, you also get a little bit of the detail in the back too, because it has been raised. If it was sitting flat, you wouldn't be able to pick up anywhere near the definition of the rear end of the car.
Cardboard roller tubes are brought in and used to create borders for the pool of water. As the crew continues work on the set, Collins pulls the FOBA stand back onto the marked position and swings the 8x10 into place to prepare for his first 8x10 check print. Plastic aprons are placed around the wheels to cover thin sheets of wood set under each tire to keep the wheels above water level. Collins then goes under a dark cloth to focus and compose the shot as the crew begins setting up the Broncolor strobe systems.
Covered with white seamless paper dropped, okay? So you're gonna have to roll out a piece, tape it up, bring them up on two stands, let them drop, light goes over the top, bounces down through. Now
The lighting plan calls for a large sheet of white seamless background paper to be fixed to a steel rod, forming the main panel of illumination for the car. The seamless panel is then placed on two light stands and set as close to the car as possible, making sure it stays just out of the camera angle of view.
Gorgeous. Gorgeous. Absolutely. Okay, the only thing, fill with water, I'm not really sure what those final angles are going to peek out there.
As Collins checks
We'll
the
know once we
effects
fire
of the
some light
seamless
figures
panel
what
on the
the
car,
speculator is gonna be.
we can see that the large source of illumination produces clean specular highlights that reveal the true form of the automobile. The borders are completed for the pool of water, and Dean Collins begins to direct the placement of the first two strobes over the seamless.
Stop right there.
The strobes are placed so that the majority of the light will spill over the seamless and strike the white portion of the cyc wall without contaminating the black painted mountain range or the car. The remainder of the light passes through the seamless paper, making the paper a diffused light source.
Great.
Collins adds a third strobe to the setup, placing it directly behind the seamless panel to create an evenly illuminated diffused light source. The diagram reveals the relationship of each strobe to the panel, and the manner in which the light from each strobe is striking the car.
Yeah, just a little bit up.
With the strobes in place, an incident meter reading is taken to establish a hypothetical 18% value in the subject
Raise
area.
it. Fire it again.
Dean Collins talks about properly lighting the black Porsche.
11-1. On this shot, we're working between two densities, the specular highlight and the diffuse highlight. The diffuse highlight we can't change. That's the true tonality of the car. It's a black car. The only one we can really change in contrast concept is the specular highlight. The only way we can change that is not by exposure, but by the way we light it. The bigger the specular gets, if we can make a specular highlight cover an area 10 times bigger than it did, in other words, make a light source 10 times bigger, the specular highlight covers a larger area 10 times larger, the intensity of the specular highlight will drop to 1/10. So we really control the brightness of the specular relative to the diffuse by the size of the source of it. That is the only really way of controlling this contrast. You can't change it in exposure, you can only change it in the way you light it. So this is why the large sources of illuminations are produced, and that's why you try to bring them as close as you possibly can. The reflector flat on one side was brought in very, very, very close, just outside of the optic viewing, and then as much of the area is illuminated with the strobe firing through the paper. That control the brightness of the specular relative to the diffused. The only problem with that is that you're covering very, very large areas of illumination, which means as you throw your light over a large area, it diminishes in intensity because it does have to cover such a large area. So we had to really increase the watt seconds. Our strobes were set on 4 pops at approximately 1600 per head to produce the illumination relative to the aperture opening to carry the depth of field on this particular shot.
A P22 reflector panel is added to the setup before the first 8x10 test shot.
Great. I think it's coming together real well.
The first check print is exposed correctly,
calm those
but
two.
there are
This
problems
specular
that Collins
is very even,
sees
so
immediately.
They don't fight. They show the whole form. I think the only thing we're really going to have to clean up here is this transfer line here between the specular and the window. Just get up there, and the only way, that's a ceiling, right? So that's a ceiling and that's the wall. So just kind of spray it down and grade 8 it off so we have a nice transition so it's not so card, because everything else has a great line to it. Nothing's that cutting.
Yeah.
So it's just that guy right there is the only one we're going to have to calm down.
To create a gradation between the specular highlight and the diffused highlight on the windshield, Collins views the car through the 8x10 with the camera back and lens off, as an assistant feathers black spray paint onto the appropriate area of the cyc wall.
It is. Taper.
Collins then uses extra dry, powdered white antiperspirant to create false specular qualities on the hard rubber areas of the bumper and on the flat steel spokes of the front wheel. Armorall is used to bring out the specular qualities of the rubber tires. As the crew begins a final cleanup on the car, note the hard edge of the ceiling still visible in the windshield from our video camera angle, as we see the effect of the feathered black paint on the cyc wall. Collins has decided to add a 4th strobe that will bounce off the cyc wall directly behind the tail of the car, giving definition to the entire rear end of the car and the whale tail. An overall diagram of the setup reveals the placement of the 4th strobe on the set. An adjustment has also been made to the 1st strobe to spill raw light past the front of the seamless panel, striking the reflector panel and the unpainted area of the cyc wall in front of the car. This provides additional fill to the front of the car without sacrificing the quality of light that has already been achieved. The crew adds the final touches to the highly polished car as Collins prepares to take his second test shot. The Pulso power packs have been programmed to automatically fire the strobes 4 times while the shutter remains open for the test shot. Leaving the shutter open for the duration of the exposure also allows time to burn in the effects of the interior dome lights inside the car and the amber parking lights.
Oh God, it's upside down.
Quick, stand your head.
All right, that's it. Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah. Yeah, except I'm gonna have to
The
even out
results
that
of the
whole thing,
second
right?
check print are excellent.
Yeah, really
The
open that
final
up, didn't it?
stages of production can now begin.
Beauty. Yeah. We're gonna have to clean up that whole
We've got a
base
glitch
right there.
in here. What's this right here?
It's something in the paper, but I think we calming that down. Let's open it up real
Yeah,
well.
that's nice.
One last false highlight is sprayed onto the black windshield wipers as Collins gets valuable input from his crew before moving toward the final image.
That little dipple is my only thing. Did anybody figure what that dipple was?
That's the paper. That's the
It's
paper.
a really teeny little, teeny on the very, very bottom.
Yeah.
The signal has been given to begin filling the plastic pool with water. Dean Collins comments on the use of water in a studio.
Yeah, probably the most important thing is that when you hire your assistants for this shot, hire assistants that you don't like a lot. Because they may not make it through the whole thing. There's a lot of power running through that, a lot of water every place, and make sure that if you do send one out to fix something up out there with make sure it's one that you don't like a whole lot. Yeah, you send them out there and say, good luck, right. But a lot of care. Whenever you do drop in water, it's best to have a double basin. First of all, one layer of plastic to do the shot and another layer underneath it to protect any leaks that come through, because there's nothing worse than the middle of the shot. You spring a leak and it's kind of like you're getting so close and now you're worried about the water damage in the studio relative to getting the shot, and that can really break it up.
As the pool of water begins to fill, reflections of the painted mountain range can be easily seen. Special care has been taken to keep all electrical cords and equipment off of the ground and clear of any water. Blocks of dry ice are broken into small pieces, providing more surface area for a better reaction to the water. After many hours of preparation, the excitement begins to build for Collins and his crew. The first piece of dry ice reveals the effect to Collins, and he gives a signal to activate the remainder of the ice for the final exposures.
Okay. I kick that back end just a little bit because it's a little too bubbly, doesn't it? Okay, Spence, how about one that's bubbling up too much?
The crew clears the area, and Collins is patient to wait as the fog begins to settle under the car. The moment is right, and Dean Collins begins making the final exposures on film.
God, the smoke's perfect right now.
The highly reflective Porsche has been captured on film. A look at the evolution of this photograph reveals the effect of each strobe that Collins used. Our first diagram shows the placement of the first 2 strobes firing over the large panel of seamless paper. This defines the top edge of the car and illuminates the mountain range, which is visible on the front hood. With the addition of a third strobe aimed directly at the seamless paper, the light fires through the paper and defines the side panel of the car. The large source of diffused light produces clean specular highlights that begin to reveal the true form of the car. The fourth strobe is placed at the far end of the seamless panel, bouncing light off the back cyc wall onto the rear of the car. Also, an adjustment is made to the first strobe to spill light past the seamless panel and onto the reflector and front cyc wall. The effect of the fourth strobe is seen in the added definition to the rear of the car and whale tail, while the adjustment to the first strobe brings cleaner highlights and increased definition to the front end of the car. The large pool of water brings the reflections of the mountain range into the foreground areas, and the final addition of dry ice completes the evolution of the photograph. The addition of an amber gel to the fourth strobe provides some interesting variations of Heavenly Porsche.
When lighting the shot, realize you're dealing totally with specularity. Sometimes people think that lighting black cars are the biggest problem. They really aren't, because you know exactly what you're doing. It's very obvious what you're doing. You're dealing between diffuse and specular, and there's no question. But realize that this car is going to see everything, so keep your sets real clean, and realize a white cup in the back of your studio can show up in this car. Some places a little bitty hot spot. So it's really an investigation of reflections at all times. Sometimes you can't create those reflections. Realize that. Some surfaces, some of the materials here are flat plastics, or they're a flat metal, and you're going to have to produce some artificial highlights. That's where Arid Extra Dry or some kind of spray-on deodorant type, which creates that artificial specular highlight, helps, because you can't always do it with light. And sometimes realize that these particular shots, they call for large budgets. A lot of money's put in these shots because these companies have a lot of money. So anything you don't get on the set, realize don't stop everything, completely try to fix it. Sometimes you will have to rely a little bit on retouching these, because relative to the final cost and the entire production, the retouching is probably one of the cheapest things they're going to have.
Eye-catching clarity and product definition were the objects of this illustrative shot, designed and executed by Dean Collins. Entitled Levitation, this photograph has the look of expensive retouching, but the final image is actually completed on a single sheet of film, with the help of a little Collins magic.
We were originally commissioned by Calumet Photographic to shoot this particular shot for the cover of their catalog. So we had two things to overcome, you might say. First of all, we had to deal with a photographic product in a photographic environment to identify what's inside the catalog, to say that it is a photographic catalog. And secondly, we had to produce an image which was so interesting and so unique that people that make a living producing interesting imagery would want to look at it. That's where the neon concept came in, and the actual floating suspension aspect makes photographers inquisitive, like, gee, how was that done? So they would open the publication up and find out, the concept of what was inside the catalog.
Entering the Fine Light studio, assistant Kevin Scott Schumacher begins to set up for the first stage of this two-part shoot. An 8x10 camera is mounted on a tripod to act as a stand for the subject of this first exposure. The highly polished 360mm Kaltar lens is then set into place as Kevin begins the task of lighting the reflective surface. A triangular light box constructed of 3 Lightform P22 panels is set directly in front of the lens. 2 layers of translucent fabric create the main diffusion panel, while the 2 remaining panels contain the light and act as gobos. A bare bulb Pulso 4 strobe head is placed on a light stand and set inside the light box, facing away from the translucent panel. Because the inside of the box is lined with white reflective fabric, the strobe light will bounce off of the back of the box and produce a soft, even illumination on the panel. This bounce box approach to lighting highly reflective objects eliminates the problem of hot spots that may show up on the surface of the product. Lightform double clips are used to secure the back of the light box and contain the light. The strobe is connected to a Pulso 4 power pack, which Kevin sets to the appropriate power. Single clips are used to pull wrinkles from the diffusion fabric that may show up in the photograph due to the extreme specular resolution of the highly polished lens. With the basic setup complete, Collins rolls the Phobostand into place with a 90mm lens on the 4x5 camera. The flat black wall will serve as a background for the photograph.
Clever kind of guy, you know?
Collins then locks the camera stand into a solid position to begin his work. Working with a black product on a black background, a viewing hood is added to the 4x5 for viewing ease. Collins knows that his camera would not normally carry focus across the entire face of the lens, so he uses a swing on the camera. By utilizing this effect, the plane of focus can be shifted to the critical areas of the product that would otherwise fall out of the depth of focus. This is known as a Scheimpflug effect. Collins turns the Kaltar lens so the product name can be easily seen, and then checks his focus and the position of the lens on the ground glass. A white card is held behind the product lens for easy viewing, as Collins adjusts the horizontal support arm on the camera stand for perfect positioning.
Perfect, perfect.
With the elements set in position, Dean directs his assistant Kevin to move the light box until the optimum specular coverage on both the metal rim and the glass element is achieved. Working from the final image, a highlight of the lens reveals the specular qualities that the large source of illumination provides.
Okay, Kevin, give me the end.
The studio lights are dimmed, so Collins can use a flashlight to make a final check of critical focus on the front and the back of the lens.
But I can't pick it up. Okay, now put me on the back. Check the background right here.
An incident meter reading is then taken with the dome of the meter facing the light source, and Collins finds that he is more than 2 stops off of the f45 reading he needs to carry focus. He increases the power to a full 3200 watt-seconds.
Okay, can we just hold it right back it up
Next,
a little
a
bit.
Calumet exposure calculator, also known as a 2-inch rule, is held in the subject area to determine the bellows extension factor. The exposure ruler, which is placed on the ground glass to measure the image size, shows a 1 1/2 stop light loss. A second, more concise reading reads f45, but with the 1 1/2 stop bellows factor, Collins must fire his strobe 3 times, which equals a 1 1/2 stop increase in light to retain his depth of field at f45. An aperture of f45 is dialed in on the 4x5. The camera is loaded with Polaroid for the first check print. The shutter will remain open while the Pulso power pack automatically fires the strobe 3 times and then resets itself for the next exposure.
Great.
Collins uses Polaroid 55 positive-negative film when shooting dark objects such as a lens. When backlit, this film shows greater detail in the blacks, enabling a photographer to see any problems in the darker areas of the film.
Just to give some shine to it. But I think if you would take the black felt, so just we're going to drop some reflectors right in here and just to open up both those sides. Do you have the negative?
Dean also examines the Polaroid negative with a high-powered loop to check for critical focus in the image.
Yeah, front and back's fine. Front's real sharp. Just a little tack out in the back.
Collins talks about lighting the highly reflective lens.
The actual, we'll call it framing lenses, the one top and bottom, were kind of difficult to record on film because they weren't going to have a neon around them. They weren't going to have their own shape separated out from the background. So we had to really produce what we'll call lighting contrast on them. There was tonal contrast on them. I mean, it's a black lens, and this black lens has white lettering, so you have black and white already there. But to create shape and roundness on this lens, we had to work with specularity, shine within the material. So working with a white the proper white reflective materials, silver reflective materials around it to create shine surface to show that it is a round lens, that it wasn't flat, was probably the most difficult thing about these two exposures. And we were so close to it. So we were in close. We're trying to carry depth of field from the front to the very back edge. So we had to work with the best camera movements possible, and we had to carry the maximum depth of field with our f-stops. We had to shoot it all at f/45.
After viewing the first check print, Dean decided that a black velvet bib was needed to cover the base of the lens. To create the needed specular highlights on the barrel of the lens, Collins uses tiny silver reflectors, which are small pieces of cardboard cut from a Polaroid box. By correctly placing the reflectors, specular highlights are created to add proper dimension and roundness to the barrel of the lens.
Who needs assistance anymore, huh?
Now ready for his second check print, Collins will take the same exposure twice on the same sheet of film. The first exposure will place the image of the lens on one edge of the film. By removing the camera back and replacing it upside down, the second exposure will occur on the opposite side of the film. This will enable Collins to check the positioning of the lenses and that there will be sufficient space for the floating optic in the center of the photograph. The second check print is a success, and Collins will move on to prepare for stage 2 of the photograph.
Bring the Keltar back around.
With a small sheet of clear acetate attached to the ground glass of the camera, Collins traces the outline of the lenses to create a reference guide for the placement of the center lens. Dean Collins explains the technique of camera registration.
There's two ways of registering these images together. You can either have two cameras, separate setup, or you can have one camera with a very good studio stand. In this case, we use one camera with the FOBA. One thing about the FOBA stand is that everything has been marked out. Any movement, any placement, you'll see along this, you'll have every last millimeter has been marked out. So if you keep a documentation of where those are and you do not move the stand from the floor, you just move the camera around to another spot, you can, within a half a centimeter, bring it back into the exact position and line it up to where you can take one exposure and then move it around and put another exposure on the same piece of film without ever taking the camera off the stand and moving it around. It's a real quick way of produce precise registration between two images.
By noting the registration numbers on the camera stand and camera, Kevin creates a series of location points that will enable Collins to return to his exact position for the final exposures. With registration complete, the camera is swung to the opposite side of the studio to begin work on the second and most complex part of the photograph. Collins begins by switching from a bag bellows on the 4x5 to a standard bellows for use with a 210mm lens. 4 clamps are then used to secure a sheet of clear plexiglass to 2 light stands. Weights are added to each stand to ensure that the plexiglass will not move once set in place. Next, a threaded aluminum bar is bolted into a hole that was previously drilled in the center of the plexiglass. The plexiglass is then cleaned thoroughly for the photograph. With Kevin holding the lens, Collins carefully hot glues the lens to the end of the aluminum rod. By making sure the support rod is directly behind the lens from camera point of view, the effect of suspending the product is easily achieved. The glue can later be removed with Bestine, a common rubber cement solvent. An empty paint can filled with cement produces a simple studio stand that Collins uses to support a P15 panel with black fabric. The panel will act as a catch for the lens, just in case.
2 stands flat, and then we got to find our drape.
To create an overhead scrim for the lens, a P22 panel with 2 layers of translucent fabric is attached to 2 stands with EC1 clamps. Using a boom stand, Kevin positions a bronze-color strobe with a parabolic reflector directly over the lens. As Collins sets his shot, a white card is held behind the lens for contrast. A view through the ground glass reveals that the lens has been centered and is in position relative to the tracings from the previous set. 2 nylon curtains, one translucent and the other reflective, are suspended with double clips on elastic bungee cords to create a light tint. A diagram reveals that by keeping the curtains far enough away from the lens, reflections of the white curtains in the plexiglass can be avoided. Note the specular highlight on the side of the lens, created by the curtain that is now illuminated by a second strobe. Collins directs Kevin to back the strobe up, creating a larger light source and a less intense specular highlight, thus producing the proper ratio of the specular to the diffused highlight. By utilizing a symmetrical strobe system, the power of the modeling light from each strobe enables Collins to set the contrast by eye. Working from a previous incident reading, a test shot is made at f45. Again, note the specular highlight created by the curtain, a relatively small source of illumination. As seen in the diagram, the second curtain acts as a reflector fill, providing detail to the right side of the lens, while the large overhead scrim creates a specular highlight on the lens, helping to identify surface qualities and the shape of the lens. Satisfied with the lighting for the first 2 exposures, Collins begins working on the background neon effect. A P22 frame secured to 2 light stands provides the foundation for a large sheet of opaque plexiglass held to the frame with utility clips. Black Savage background paper is then rolled down the face of the plexiglass and cut to size. Gaffer's tape is used to fasten the paper to the top and the bottom of the frame.
The most difficult part about this shot was produce the exact alignment of the neon effect around the floating lens. That was done by taking the back off of the camera, which was taking the picture, taking a hot light, aiming it through the optic which was going to record the lens, which then projected an exact silhouette of that lens onto a background which was about 6-7 feet behind it, which was just an opal piece of plastic, a large piece of plexiglass covered with black paper. Then cutting out that silhouette, tracing out that silhouette and cutting it out gave us an exact alignment of where the neon would be. So during the final exposure, the actual neon effect was even all the way around the lens, and it wasn't off one side or the other. The alignment is probably the most difficult thing of any neon effect.
To produce an accurate silhouette of the lens on the background, Collins places a 650-watt quartz light directly behind the view camera. To protect the ground glass from heat damage, it has been removed and replaced with a sheet of Roscolux Tough Frost, turning the camera into a projector of light. A change in aperture size directly affects the beam of light, as Collins controls the sharpness of the image, while Kevin works quickly to sketch the outline with a grease pencil.
Like that gives a sharp edge of where to feel like that. See how it comes in sharper?
The traced area is then cut out of the paper, leaving the opaque plexiglass exposed. Double-stick tape is used to hold the edges of the paper down, producing a clean, accurate outline of the lens. Collins places a third Broncolor strobe on a stand and aims it directly at the back of the plexiglass cutout. A Roscoe Lux red gel is added, and Kevin turns the modeling on to check the effect. A diagram of the overall setup shows the relationship of each element that Collins used to create the suspended lens and neon effect. The distance from the 4x5 camera to the neon plexiglass is necessary to achieve a soft neon effect by throwing the background out of focus. The large sheet of plexiglass is needed to cover the angle of view of the 210mm lens. The next step is for Collins to choose the f-stop that will produce the desired neon effect for the second of two exposures.
8, 11, 16, yeah, it looks just, it's going to be real, okay, about f16 is what we want to shoot that background color on. I think even the blue and the red would look fine at 16s. Yeah, it's just right neon. It's 8's just too much glow. I think it'll be real nice and tight neon.
Collins selects f16 to produce a clean silhouette of the foreground lens and the proper neon effect. Again, the distance from the camera to the plexiglass must be sufficient to throw the background out of focus at f16 to create a neon effect. Dean uses a booster 2 with his Minolta meter to take a reflective reading of the neon directly off of the ground glass. This reading will establish the desired intensity of color relative to 18%. Through the choice of aperture for this second exposure, Dean selects a 2:1 red, or a 36% red. For those without the capabilities of a booster 2, a reflective receptacle reading can be just as effective, taken from the light coming through the plexiglass.
Value to the 10th of a stop. So yeah, there's no bellows at all in this thing. Huh. Check it again.
Dean Collins explains the control of colored backgrounds.
The glowing effect of neon is dependent on the aperture that the camera is set at when you take that picture. At f64, you're going to have a very in-focus glow, which the cutout paper looks like a cutout part. At say f8, it's going to be very out of focus and very, very neon. So depending on your aperture will depend on how much that neon effect behind the lens is going to be. Color zoning, chroma zones, is going to utilize the color control here. What we're going to do is if I take a reflective reading off of the ground glass with a booster 2 from Minolta, it's an attachment which goes to our Minolta 3. When you take a reading right off the ground glass, it gives you a reading to set your camera at to make that a middle tone value. In other words, 18% red in this case, or we'll say the value of 1. If we then make the reflective reading come off that reading something like f22, but we set our camera at f16, well, f22 is going to be twice as bright as 18%. We're going to say a 36% red or a 2:1 red. If we consider 18% 1, then we consider twice that a 2:1. The lens is being exposed with at f.
Collins prepares to take a test print to check exposure and registration of the neon. The first exposure of the lens is shot at f45 for maximum depth of field.
f16 for a 2:1 red. Let me cover this up so I don't show up the reflection of that plex. Especially these chromium wires can show up so easily. Just about like that, just so I'm out of the frame. Okay, ready? Okay.
Kevin turns off the strobe surrounding the lens and reroutes the appropriate power to the background strobe for a 2:1 red. Collins adjusts the aperture to f16 for the second exposure. During the first exposure, black velvet was draped over the neon cutout to ensure total color saturation of the neon without contamination. Collins makes a second exposure of the neon only.
Super. All right. Perfect. Just right there. We're going to have to shave that down. 16. Probably should shoot that at 11. I think we'll get a little bit better neoning.
After examining the Polaroid check print, Dean decides to open the aperture from f16 to f11 to create a slightly softer neon. By increasing the aperture, the power of the background strobe must be cut in order to retain the 2:1 red. Collins adds a Roscoe Lux one-stop ND gel to the background strobe to cut its power.
A problem with exposing two images onto one sheet of film is that you have two possible different exposures. So by running your test on 2 different sheets of film, expose one image on one sheet, one image on another, develop those 2 out, find out how far they are from each other in exposure, make sure that they are corrected at the time of their exposure, then you can expose both of those onto one sheet of film and guarantee it, when developed out, both of them have the exact exposure necessary.
Working for his final exposures, Collins makes 6 exposures of the suspended lens and neon on film and 2 on Polaroid without developing them. In this way, Dean can use the Polaroids to check registration of the remaining exposures from the first setup and be assured of perfect registration when he completes the images on film.
Yeah. Stay right there. Okay, wait a second. Let me just go ahead.
Now ready to add the final 2 exposures, Collins swings the phobostat back to the original marks and begins to reset for the shots, which completes the remarkable evolution of levitation.
There was 2 difficult things about the shot. First of all, conceiving the shot, then doing it. The conception of the shot was really given my responsibility. I was hired by Calumet. They said, come up with the shot, you think it up for our cover to create an impact aspect. Many hours on airplanes, a lot of time on drawing board, sketching it out in my mind, until finally I came up with exactly what I wanted it to look like. Then coming up with the physiological restraints, the physiological laws I must follow to come up with the shot, especially when there's not going to be any airbrushing involved. I didn't want any airbrushing involved with this shot. I wanted it to be totally mine. So the proper suspension aspect, how to create a registered neon, how to get just a certain form around the lenses to where I had to separate black from black, meaning the black walls from the black lenses to create their full shape, and make sure the color value was right on the money was really, to me, this was the biggest treat of my career, at least of here recent, is that they've given me an opportunity to show my stuff in front of other commercial photographers to grab their attention, and to try to do it totally photographically I think was one of the biggest challenges, and it worked. We're real proud of the cover. It's got a tremendous amount of attention, and it makes people open up their minds a little bit about saying, well, you know, I think I should possibly start working a little bit more with my brains instead of with retouchers doing a lot of the work. Whenever doing a merchandise catalog, there's a tremendous amount of work by the art director and not quite as much work by the photographer. But the photographer's going to light it properly and expose it properly, but the basic layout and the structure and the design of the set's going to be done by the art director, and that's where most of the time is going to be spent. So working with multiple sets is very useful in this situation, to where when the art director finishes one layout, they can go to the next set and the photographer can step in and light and expose and set up on that one. So working with 3 sets, you can rotate around and come up with 15 to 20 shots in a single day. In this studio, basically I handle all the fashion, and Terry T handles all the merchandise photography. We work on an associate basis. We find the success in that is the art director feels they have an expert no matter what we're dealing with. If we're dealing with merchandise, Terry T is an expert in merchandise because that's all he does. If we deal with in fashion, then I'm doing the fashion, and that's all I do. So there's a much stronger confidence within the art directors.
This striking athletic shoe image is a good example of imaginative lighting, which emphasizes the strong selling points of this product. From the company logo to the design of the sole, every item that makes this product unique is included in the final photograph. Associate photographer Terry Tebow begins setting up for the shoot by arranging the products on a sheet of 14% smoked glass. Lightform EC1 clamps firmly secure the 2x4 wooden frame, which supports the glass surface. Studio technical assistant Ryan Hastings lowers a Broncolor strobe over the set into approximate position. Terry T then pulls in an 8x10 Cinar P2 camera on a FOBA studio stand. The art director asked for an extremely sharp, striking image. Therefore, the 8x10 was utilized. With the camera in position, Terry and Ryan use a Calumet 2-inch rule for checking the bellows extension factor. By placing the 2-inch square in the scene and reading the calculator on the ground glass, you can read the amount of loss due to the distance from the lens to the film plane. In this instance, there was 1 2/3 stops loss. Ryan takes an incident meter reading with the dome aimed at the source of illumination to properly expose the product. The result of a single direct light source can be identified as a hard edge transfer between the diffused highlight and the shadow. This creates an image of high contrast. A Bogan magic arm is added to the top of one of the 4 light stands supporting a wooden frame. The magic arm and an additional stand will support a Lightform P15 covered with a translucent material. This increases the effective size of the light source by dispersing it over a larger area. Specularity is diminished, and edge transfer between the diffused highlight and shadow is increased. Black sheets of cardboard are utilized as gobos and placed directly on the translucent fabric. This will control the size and shape of the actual light source. The strip light opening allows the light to diffuse greatly in a horizontal direction, while diffusing slightly in a vertical direction. A graphic demonstrates the path of light as it goes through the fabric and evenly illuminates the products. Notice the difference between the direct strobe and the diffused light source. As the size of the source increases, the edge transfer between the diffused highlight and the shadow increases at the same rate, creating a wraparound quality of light. A second Broncolor strobe with a spot grid attached is added to the set and placed on a Bogan floor stand directly under the shoes. The glass surface allows the ability to light from below the set, accenting or highlighting any special features of the product. The company logo is very evident as the accent light from below is added. This type of accent lighting is not possible with a sheet of solid plexiglass for a tabletop surface. The accent lighting is controlled by taping sheets of black cardboard to the bottom of the glass tabletop surface. This method can prevent light from striking undesired areas of interest while concentrating light in the primary areas of the product. In addition, the shadows create a more graphic design. Again, a graphic demonstrates how the light is aimed directly at the sole of the shoe through the smoked glass surface. The result is a much more controlled accent, with light blocked off of the shoestring area and concentrated to the sole area. Also, the sole of the shoe in the foreground is no longer receiving any light from below. Terry adds another accent strobe for emphasizing one of the more unique features of this particular product. Again, a spot grid is used on the reflector head, which keeps the light source highly directional. The light is aimed at a silver light-right reflector, which is angled to allow light to travel through the 3 holes in the heel of the shoe. This is the major selling point of the product. Therefore, it's heavily emphasized.
Right there. Now push it away from you just a little bit so we can get all 3 holes lined up. Keep going, keep going. There it is, right there. Good.
To further emphasize the sole area, a red gel is placed over the accent strobe. In the drawing, the light is shown as it is aimed into the silver reflector and redirected through the holes in the heel area of the sole. With the addition of the red gel-covered highlight, the image begins to take shape. Notice the toe area of the back shoe, as it also receives a small amount of red light. The holes in the heel seem to add an extra dimension to the photograph. Black cardboard is used to prevent the floor and background from being seen from the camera's position. Ryan adds the background strobe to the set and tapes a Roscoe No. 80 blue gel to the reflector. To utilize this symmetrical system, the strobe is plugged into the same power pack as the previous 3 strobes. Terry then directs Ryan on exact placement of the background strobe from camera position.
A foot. Keep going, keep going, keep going, okay. Now aim it up just a little bit.
Before exposing the final Polaroid, Terry uses the reflective probe for the Broncolor FCM meter to set the background color values using Collins' chromosome theory. The probe takes exact readings on the film plane and is not affected by any shift of the camera's lens or bellows factor.
Okay, 45 1/3.
The Broncolor Pulso 4 power pack is programmed for the correct number of flashes relative to the aperture, bellows extension, and amount of power used for the exposure. Before pulling the dark slide on the final Polaroid 8x10, Terry is careful to test the shutter release cable for sync.
Okay, right there, we got F32, and here we go, just like that. Great, we got it. Okay, let's process this baby.
The exposed 8x10 Polaroid is then loaded into the automatic processor. As the print is pulled, notice the background color value and how it balances with other colors in the image.
There we go, there we go. Oh, yeah. I like that guy. Yeah, that background is good. Yeah. I like the change we made in the shoelace here.
Terry T. and art director Carrie Nitchie of the Hahn Company discuss the Polaroid before finalizing the image onto Ektachrome sheet film.
The feature that we wanted to show, the air and the sole, and then the Nike Air. What I really like is the quality that you can really see in the shoe and all the textures. It looks great.
That we need to change?
Yeah, one little texture. That little fuzzy thing right there. We need to get rid of that.
I think we can put that in there.
Yeah, it looks really good.
I think it's nice.
The final graphic of this image details the background light, as it is added for depth and separation. The final result shows how the blue color value enhances the background of the image and helps create a graphic design to the photograph which makes the product almost futuristic in its appearance. The even coating of specularity on the sunglasses is the primary concern in this wide-angle photograph. Terry selected the clay tiles for a working surface because they tend to enhance the photograph without taking away from the products.
Often we're working with glass, in this case sunglasses, our director will request either a very fine surface quality to show the quality of the glass, or they want it softened up. It's really personal taste. If the art director does want a softening of the shine, we'll call it specular edge transfer. This can be accomplished by placing a diffusion scrim between the actual glasses and the light box you're lighting them with. That'll break up the edge between the actual, what they call diffuse highlight and specular, and create a softening quality. Sometimes create a little bit of a fog effect on the glass, but if that's desired, it can be obtained this way.
The photograph begins by placing a strobe with a parabolic reflector directly over the set. Looking through the viewing hood of the Cinar 4x5 P2, Terry adjusts the props for the most impact. A 90mm lens is being used to add wide-angle perspective to the image. A specular highlight is defined as a mirrored image of the device creating the highlight. The parabolic reflector on the strobe head is easily seen in the lens before the specular control begins. To control the specularity, Terry begins to assemble a medium chimera light box. Terry begins installing 4 pre-bent rods into the slots provided. The rods are designed to firmly hold tension on the collapsible lightweight box. The speed rings, which connect the strobe head to the box, are very easy to connect. Velcro is used to prevent light from escaping around the strobe head. The reflector head is removed and a medium chimera light box is bayoneted into position on the strobe head. The box is rolled into position above and slightly behind the set on a Bogen super boom. With the light box in place, the specularity is diminished in intensity at the same rate it increases in size. The result is a more pleasing photograph of a much more saleable product. Terry and Patty add more diffusion by placing a Lightform P15 with Roscoe Tough Frost between the Chimera box and the product. Lightform EC1 clamps support the 42 by 42 inch panel. A graphic illustration demonstrates the light as it travels through the translucent fabric of the lightbox cover and the Roscoe Tough Frost material. As the light strikes the product, it has been diffused heavily twice. Therefore, it is extremely even in its disbursement and lower in its intensity. The quality of light now has a completely different look than with a single diffused source. The first accent strobe is placed to the camera's right and covered with a spot grid. The strobe is more directional when using a grid than when using the standard reflector with no attachments. A sheet of black cardboard is used as a gobo to further control the accent lighting. The accent strobe can be seen as it is directly aimed at the foreground area of the set and partially blocked by black cardboard gobo. This results in a bright area in the lower right portion of the photograph. The accent adds depth to the image by adding specular brightness to an otherwise flat tabletop surface. The second accent strobe is added to the opposite side of the set for additional separation and depth. Again, a spot grid and black cardboard control the direction and intensity of light to a given area. The light from the second accent strobe is also directly pointed at the foreground of the image. The added highlight is considered fine-tuning at this point of the photograph. As the second kicker light is added for the final image, notice the difference in the design of the tiles. The true shape and form is identified by the specular hard light created from each side, and the softness of the specularity in the glasses results in a photograph which speaks well of the product. This delicious image for a popular candy company was the hands-down favorite of the crew. Controlling the intensity of light on the box top while maintaining an even specularity was the main goal of this photograph. Unfortunately, the props didn't last very long. Let's take a closer look at the steps involved in making this photograph. The lighting begins with a Broncolor impact strobe directly over the product. The overhead strobe by itself produces an image of high specularity on the product, as well as the tiles being used as a tabletop surface. Note the hard shadow edge created by the side of the box. Terry again uses a medium chimera light box, which lowers specularity by dispersing it over a larger area. With the light box in place, the shine or specularity of the highly reflective surface takes on a new look. Also notice the diminishment of intensity of the specular highlight relative to the previous photograph. Black cardboard is used as specular gobos and placed directly on the light box to block light from reflecting onto the product at the reflective box top area. Terry adds a viewing hood to the camera to help in seeing the subtle changes in the overall image. A graphic look at the set shows the lighting as it falls evenly on the set, except for the area receiving no light because of the specular gobos. A closer look shows the difference with and without the gobos. The gobos remove the specularity, revealing the true diffused highlight on the box top, showing detail in the gold paper surface. A second impact strobe is placed on the right side of the set for use as an accent on the dark chocolates. A spot grid is again used for more directional control. Black cardboard serves a dual purpose, as it protects the camera lens from flare for the accent, and it's used to concentrate the accent light to a specific area of the image. The angle or direction of light from the accent strobe is shown as it adds detail to the chocolates and the foreground of the image. The dark chocolate candy is much easier to identify with the aid of the accent strobe. Remember that dark objects rely on specularity for shape and form. Therefore, the accent strobe was not diffused. A silver light-right reflector, with magnets for ease of adjustment, is used to highlight or accent the edge of the candy box opposite the accent strobe. The silver redirects the path of the light to the dark area. The reflector adds an extra highlight to the side of the box, and the added black gobo at camera's right tones down the bright area in the foreground of the photograph. Other images which were used in the catalog include this photograph for one of the country's leading luggage retailers. The simplicity and quality of the lighting is what makes this type of photography profitable. The overhead chimera light box provided the soft, even illumination, and the composition carries the theme. Another example of double diffusing, this his and hers watch photograph includes the element of specular gobos as in previous sections on this tape. The reflection of the light source in the faces of the products were blocked out by two small cutouts placed on the actual light source. Again, the Roscoe Tough Frost material provides the soft light quality needed for a photograph of highly reflective objects. This photograph of three very unusual gifts was probably the most challenging because of the extremely reflective yet transparent surfaces. The lighting was once again an overhead box fired through a P15 light form covered with tough frost. On the tough frost was a sheet of black cardboard used to block the highlight on top of the acrylic radio. A second strobe with a light form translucent fabric was used on the right to add direction to the lighting, while at the same time creating an even specularity due to its 42 by 78 inch size. Terry uses a strobe placed close to the translucent fabric of a P22 panel for the bright highlight on the left side of this shoe image. For the highlight on the right side, he backs the strobe away from the fabric, thereby increasing the size of the source and lowering its intensity. An overhead light box gives an overall soft ambience to the image and evenly illuminates the tile surface.
Catalogs aren't often the most exciting and creative situations, but they can be one of the more profitable in photography. As long as you have a full understanding of the concept of three-dimensional form, understanding of standardization of black and white, and the ability to produce imagery quickly, accurately, and without having to do many retakes. So a full understanding of your craft photographically is probably the key essential to make a good solid profit margin in this business called catalog photography.
Hello?
Oh, wait a minute. Come on, Tony.
Exactly. So,
One thing we find as a specialty is earthquake catalogs. Very few people can do them, and we have the location being in Southern California.
that strip, it's 20. I can make a nice strip for this one.
Okay, I'll start out up here and I'll pan down.
Okay.
Pan
You
down.
recording?
No.
The lights on.